At the Reformation, how it affected Linlithgow and what it was like living in the town at that time. Linlithgow was granted a royal charter in 1389 by King Robert II, and by the mid-16th century, it was an important market town, brought more alive every so often by the arrival of a ruling monarch, en route to his royal palace, situated on St. Michael's Mount, high above the 41-hectare loch, the largest body of fresh water in the Lothians. Eastwards of its main thoroughfare, called the King's High Road, were gateways through the town's wall. And there they are. The Low Port, leading to the track to Blackness and bisected by the Middle Raw, the High Port, which led on to the carriage route to Edinburgh. The west portal into the town stood beside the residence of the Hamiltons of Silverton Hill, a forerunner of the present Westport House. It was built right on the main roadway before the track was lowered in the 18th century. Protected on the north side by the waters of the loch, the south margin was guarded by a town wall, strengthened in the early 16th century after the disastrous Battle of Flodden, in fear of an attack by an English army. No wynds existed then as another safety precaution against enemy invasion, although the collapse of a wall in what is now Dogwell Wynd led to an unofficial route through the town wall. The town council often tried to get the owners of properties bordering the wall to build up their yeardheads as a barrier against the enemy in time of war, or in more peaceful times to keep out sorners, vagabonds, itinerant musicians, and Egyptians, as Romanes were called. Yet more council efforts were constantly made to keep the high street free from animal manure heaps and the discarded contents of chanties, and to clean up the fetid waters of the Duckburn and the Bellsburn, which both ran as open sewers across the main causeway. What saved the townsfolk from contracting even more disease than they did was the presence of public wells, bringing fresh water down from the Bathgate Hills. Some degree of hygiene was also provided by the fact that, as an embryonic leather-producing town, the process of heating oak bark for tanning sent up clouds of disinfecting steam into the atmosphere. Within the township itself stood a cluster of timber-built, largely thatched buildings. They were very prone to catching fire, so outside ovens were built. This one on the right still exists behind 46 High Street. Behind each property stretched long tail rigs or burgage plots, arranged as you see on the map like a herringbone fashion, and used for growing crops or rearing animals. The houses rarely had windows or chimneys, and the doorway was often just a leather cover. The floor was of gravel or beaten earth, with a central fireplace consisting of a clay-lined hollow or a stone slab. Smoke would find its own way out through the many gaps in the roof. In the winter, it was usual to bring an animal into the house which had not been slaughtered, and it supplied heat and protein in the form of blood, drained off and cooked into a black pudding. Some houses became stronger, built using daub, that is, mixed mud and dung, slapped onto a wooden wattle. A few began to use slates on the roof instead of turf or straw. Close to these primitive lodgings were a few grander edifices, because all classes of society lived together. The carpenter living between the Baron Ross of Hawkhead and Peter Cornwall, Laird of Bonnard, the weaver right next to Lord Hamilton of Silverton Hill. Members of the aristocracy lived in stone constructions like these, with pottery tiles on the roof, brought in from the Low Countries to Blackness as ballast in trading ships. By the loch side, for example, was a substantial residence belonging to John Hamilton, Archbishop of St Andrews, primate of all Scotland. He also owned the building on the south side of the High Street, bottom left, from which the Regent Murray was shot and killed in 1570. Not far away was the courtly residence of the second Earl of Arran, great-grandson of King James II, a man who initially supported the Protestant cause before going back to being a Catholic, later fighting for the French regent, Mary of Guise, and jointly leading the French troops at an anti-Protestant incident near Cooper. Arran later reverted back to Protestantism after hearing John Knox preach in St John's Kirk in Perth on June the 10th, 1559. Arran joined the Lords of the Congregation. Knox that day had chosen his sermon as the cleansing of the temple, when Christ drove out undesirables and a wave of destruction followed. The Earl of Arran rode with the Protestant army, called by John Knox himself the rascal multitude, first to Stirling and then Linlithgow. The first that many knew of their arrival was the sound of metal smashing into stone as the mob ransacked St Michael's Church, cleansing all traces of popery from the building. Armed with hammers and pickaxes, the iconoclastic throng set about demolishing the statues of saints from every one of the 23 niches around the building, and some of these carvings were quite new at the time. The kirkyard lay strewn with the scattered remains, holy heads, crushed crosses, defaced Catholic emblems. Only the figure of the town's patron Saint Michael remained, his wings clipped, but otherwise intact, his spear still visibly slaying the dragon of evil. Sadly, the church's guardian angel was not strong enough to stop the devastation going on within the hallowed interior. Feelings were running high and desecration followed. Hammered to pieces was the holy font in whose waters Mary Stuart had been baptized 17 years before. Crushed to a mangled heap were holy vessels, chalices and patens, either trodden underfoot or carried off as trophies. What were not rescued were the elaborately carved altars situated around the church, all of which were destroyed or defaced, like the one on the left. On the right is the altar frontage depicting Christ's betrayal in the garden. It was found buried in the graveyard and is now on display in the vestry. The records were encouraged by one of the Protestant lords yelling, "Cleanse the lot, ding doon the Pope." Sir James Balfour records that a local blacksmith took the recommendation literally and, entering the nearby palace, applied his forge hammer to the statue of Pope Julius II, which stood in a niche above the entrance to the southwest tower. The empty space today bears testimony to that act. Another statue was smashed above the new entrance, but spared were the figure of the Virgin Mary and a vase of flowers, symbolizing her purity and innocence. Obviously, destroying the mother of Jesus Christ was a step too far, even for Protestant rebels. A small contingent of the baying mob went off to find other Roman Catholic establishments. They found that the chapel of St Ninian at the West Port had long been abandoned and was now being used for secular use, its burial ground abandoned and overgrown. Similarly, the chapel of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the Middle Raw had fallen into disrepair, its almshouse in ruins. Dilapidated walls were still there in 1778, and a ruin is still marked on the 1847 OS map. An emergency archaeological search was carried out on this site in 1981-82, before the construction of William Lowe's supermarket. Unsurprisingly, given that the site had been used for an explosive factory and an ICI pharmaceutical works, little was found, except some medieval pottery shards, and the tantalizing possibility of the edge of the chapel's burial ground, known as the Fare Ye Well Yard. The Carmelite friary standing above the town was also visited by the reformers and found too to be devoid of life. Its 3 remaining white friars departed, perhaps because they affectionately named Brethren Aboon the Toon, were well respected. Their buildings, dating back to the 13th century, were not attacked. Respect may also have been shown to the associated graveyard, containing at least 200 burials. Over time, however, the walls of the friary crumbled and the stones were taken for other projects. One piece, top left, is still visibly inserted into a wall of Nether Parkley House. The properties of the Knights of St. John, called the Mint, and the priory tenements in the Kirkgate had already been sequestered by the town's magistrates, led by Provost James Danielston, son-in-law of Linlithgow's first ever provost, Henry Forrest. Danielston had already been involved in events leading up to the Reformation, when, as Borough Commissioner, he attended a parliament in Edinburgh to discuss French King Henry II's request to marry Scots Queen Mary, then living in France, to his son Francis. Danielston was in a dilemma over his decision whether to welcome the marriage, to cement the union of France and Scotland against the old enemy England, or to be wary of further French Catholic control over Scotland's affairs. But eventually he did put his name to the marriage proposal. Incidentally, it is also Danielston's name that appears on the first ever written penalty for non-attendance at the riding of the marches. He was fined £4. It was later increased to 100, and that fine is still intimated annually by the town crier. But like the friary, the nunnery at Manuel had also seen better days, its sole occupants being a prioress and 4 nuns. Their religious house was closed down, but the occupants were fairly kindly treated and allowed to leave to live a secular life. St. Michael's Catholic clerics were not harmed either, but allowed to leave peacefully. And this included the 13 altar chaplains, whose job it had been to maintain the richly endowed and often elaborately carved holy sanctoria, all dedicated to a saint, or to such features as the Holy Trinity, the Holy Cross, the Holy Blood, or the Virgin Mary. One of the last chantry priests was Thomas Johnson, a powerful character, well connected to influential people. He had qualified as a lawyer and operated an extensive legal practice in the town. In 1540, he was appointed Keeper of the Palace, in addition to his roles as town clerk and clerk to the Sheriff Court. So his status and connections saw him being allowed to retain all his high offices and the right to remain in his church accommodation, situated in what is now the Rose Garden. He was even allowed to keep the fees he was entitled to from payments made to him as chaplain of several altars, and from St. Ninian's Chapel at Blackness, now demolished, but still the site where the Baron Bailie is annually elected into office. With their attack on idolatry over, the rascal multitude marched on to Edinburgh, a motley contingent of religious fanatics, soldiers of fortune, and opportunists, delighting in their newfound license to destroy and rob. The eminent historian T.C. Smout calls them, quote, more bandits than professional militia. The Scottish regent, Mary of Guise, widow of James V, reigning on behalf of her Linlithgow-born daughter Mary, was largely powerless. Summoning even more French troops to Edinburgh just further inflamed the reformers, who found Edinburgh full of these foreign mercenaries. A parliament was summoned to debate the situation, and as it assembled, Knox preached another blistering sermon in St. Giles, this time on the subject of the prophet Haggai, who had urged the people of Israel to repent their old ways and look to God to establish a new religion free from foreign tyranny. Suitably inflamed, Linlithgow's Provost Danielston and the other delegates voted to abolish Mass, to reject papal authority, and to adopt the Book of Discipline, setting forth the Presbyterian form of church government and a system of universal free education. Meanwhile, back in Linlithgow, the authorities, worried about possible retaliation after the attack in St. Michael's, ordered that the town walls be strengthened and a 24-hour watch put in place to keep an eye out for the arrival of French troops, who, as feared, duly entered the town. As it says in a contemporary diary, the diurnal of occurrence, they pillaged and ran a foray around Linlithgow and brought in all the cattle, horses, and other gear that might be gotten. There is some evidence that, short of funds, the French produced coinage bearing the Queen Regent's head, perhaps manufactured in the building known as the Mint, the one-time HQ of the Knights of St. John. The diurnal says that the coining irons used were seized from the Linlithgow Mint by the lords of the congregation. On the approach of a Protestant fighting force, the French troops quickly vacated the town, marched to Blackness, from where they were shipped to the besieged town of Leith, where they received the news that the Queen Regent was ill and that the Scottish Parliament had passed even more anti-Catholic decrees, declaring that they would, quote, amend all abuses, which by the malice of Satan and the negligence of men have crept into the church. Where had all this anti-Catholic sentiment begun? Its origins lay some 40 years before, when a German Catholic priest, Martin Luther, first protested in Wittenberg and wrote his 95 Theses, condemning many practices within the Roman Catholic establishment. Linlithgow's real awakening came in 1559, 13 years, in fact, after the arrest of John Knox, his incarceration in a French prison, and his brutal treatment as a galley slave, and also long after the execution of the prominent Protestant reformer George Wishart. And Linlithgow too had its Protestant martyrs. Patrick Hamilton of King's Cavil was born in the year 1504, the son of the Sheriff of Linlithgowshire, keeper of Blackness Castle. His father, also called Patrick, was killed in Edinburgh in 1520 during the famous brawl called Cleanse the Causeway. Patrick attended the Linlithgow Grammar School, staying during the week with Hamilton relatives in their High Street residence, Hamilton Lands. The school had been established under a papal edict by Pope Gregory VIII in 1187 as a place to train boy choristers so they could sing in Latin at Roman Catholic masses in St. Michael's. Learning Latin was also essential for attending university, where all the lectures were delivered in that language. Patrick was destined for the Catholic priesthood, and after an initial training in Scotland, went on to study at the Sorbonne in Paris, where he came across the writings of Martin Luther, which helped him reach the conclusion that the Roman Catholic Church was steeped in corruption and false doctrine. He would no doubt have felt very guilty at what was paying for his studies in Paris, the money coming as it did from the revenues of Fern Abbey in Rossshire, of which he had been created abbot at the age of 14. On his return to Scotland, Patrick went on a crusade, preaching on the need to reform or indeed to replace the existing church. He became a marked man and was forced to flee to Germany, where he enrolled as a student in the new University of Marburg, where he wrote his anti-Catholic book, Patrick's Places. However, believing that his mission was in his native land, he returned to his family home at King's Cavil and resumed his anti-Catholic preaching in and around Linlithgow, dressed like a Christ-like figure. He renounced clerical celibacy and married a local lady of noble rank, one he thought appropriate, for he himself was a descendant of King James II. Shortly after his marriage, he was arrested on a visit to St. Andrews, the seat of the Roman Catholic Episcopate, the centre of Catholicism in Scotland, having reputedly acquired the relics of the town's namesake, believed to be the apostle's arm, 3 fingers, a kneecap, and a tooth. At his trial in St. Andrew's Cathedral, Patrick was accused of making 13 heretical comments, such as saying that confessions and indulgences which cleared people of their sins was devilish and served no purpose. that Roman Catholic sacraments and ceremonies intended to bestow spiritual grace were ineffectual, and those who had put their faith in them died, quote, in an evil, imperfect faith and are condemned to hell. He also insisted that the Bible should be available not only in Latin, but should be translated into English or even Scots, so that all could read it and make up their own mind about its contents. His trial was a sham. He was duly sentenced to death. In order to prevent any rescue attempt, he was taken for execution on the very same day to be burned at the stake, here, just outside St. Salvator's College. The plaque on the right declares that his initials are carved in stone on the ground on the exact site of the burning, and here they are. All the students of St. Andrews University told never to stand on them, as it would lead to exam failure. Burned into the wall behind the spot is a mysterious fire-blackened impression, some say, of his face. His bravery impressed all who watched the tragedy unfold. In a rain shower, he was fastened to a stake and firewood placed around him. A quantity of gunpowder was placed under his arms and set on fire, but this only scorched his left hand and one side of his face. More powder and combustible material was brought, and at last the fire ignited and the flames slowly grew. He called out with a strong voice, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. How long shall darkness overwhelm this realm? How long wilt thou suffer the tyranny of these misguided men?" The fire eventually and blessedly took his life, but it took 6 hours. His bravery throughout, impressing all who witnessed the event. When the execution of another Linlithgow reformer, Henry Forrest, was being discussed, Archbishop Beaton's advisor, John Lindsay, remarked, "Burn him in secret, for the smoke of Maester Patrick Hamilton ha infected all those on whom it blew." Henry was accused of nothing other than showing his support for Patrick Hamilton, but that was enough to convict him. Often called Linlithgow's John Knox, he was also burned at the stake. But both executions backfired dramatically. They only increased support for the opposition cause. Forrest and Hamilton are both commemorated on the Martyrs' Memorial in St. Andrews. Patrick's sister, Catherine Hamilton, also a committed Protestant, narrowly escaped execution. She was brought to trial for heresy before James V at Holyrood House. The king, who was probably in favour of some reform within the Catholic Church, was impressed by her gracious demeanour and the conviction shown in her witty answers to his questioning. James spoke to her privately and seemed to convince her to abandon her Protestant faith. But instead she slipped away to Dunbar Castle, where she'd married the keeper, and from there fled to the English town of Berwick, where, of course, in England, Protestantism had been declared the true faith by King Henry VIII, albeit for his own marital reasons. Luther, Wishart, Hamilton, Forrest, and all the other reformers were focused on the many abuses perpetrated by the Catholic clergy, as epitomised in a character we've met previously, Archbishop John Hamilton. Supposedly celibate, he installed his mistress, Grizel Semple, in his Linlithgow mansion, where she lived with their 6 children. Such a flagrant breach of the priestly oath of celibacy was nothing compared to Hamilton's greed, a trait exhibited by other members of the clergy who attempted to extract every penny from their parishioners. This included the widespread sale of indulgences, the granting for a fee of a pardon from sinning, thus allegedly relieving the payer of having to spend time after death in purgatory. Fees were also charged for praying for a soul to help it escape from purgatory, or for the use of the mortcloth to drape over a coffin. Collections were also taken supposedly to help the poor or for the purchase of communion vessels, neither of which usually happened. One Linlithgow priest was specifically told by the town council, quote, "Do not pawn the books, silver plate and vestments of the church as others have done. nor should you lust after women, or keep for your enjoyment a continual concubine, what we might call a bidie in. Historian Smout reports that 2 out of every 7 illegitimate children in Scotland were the product of priests. And many illegitimate offspring were awarded positions in the church. And of course, having an appointment of high office could be very lucrative. The practice of simony, where church positions could be bought, and of nepotism, where relatives were installed into clerical office, were both rife. And monarchs could be corrupt as well, offering high church titles to those who could afford to pay, not those who possessed the correct spiritual qualifications. Kings could also appoint their own family members to high church position. King James IV, for example, made his 11-year-old illegitimate son, Alexander, Archbishop of St. Andrews. A later archbishop, one we've already met, David Beaton, enjoyed an extremely wealthy life of flagrant immorality. By a steady stream of mistresses, he fathered some 20 illegitimate children, many of whom he appointed to well-paid positions in the church. Other critical reports from the period mention priests swaying at the altar, drunk on communion wine, or displaying a decided lack of pastoral care. Several priests were also accused of not even being able to read or write. Monks and friars fared no better in the eyes of a growing number of people. Many monasteries had become nothing more than property-owning corporations, with sometimes laymen taking the title of abbot just to gain land. One early campaigner for change was Sir John Borthwick, who had been appointed Sheriff of Linlithgow by King James V and given apartments in the palace. At a meeting of bishops and nobles held in St. Andrews, Archbishop Beaton denounced Borthwick as, quote, a dangerous and industrious incendiary who has called indulgences devices to deceive poor, ignorant souls. And Beaton went on, in Linlithgow he has preached that the people of Scotland are blinded by the clergy and profess not the true faith, that the church ought to be reformed after the same manner as that of England. And it wasn't just England. By 1550, half of Europe had renounced papal supremacy and the Catholic Mass. Some Scottish churches began using the English prayer book, denouncing Mass as idolatrous. Merchants and mariners returning from Germany and the Low Countries brought tales of radical religious change taking place over there, and such ideas were increasingly being spread with the growth of printing presses. In Scotland, beginning with the work of Walter Chapman and Andrew Miller, and continuing with Thomas Davidson and others. Sir John Borthwick was forced to flee from Linlithgow to England, condemned as a heretic, excommunicated from the Catholic Church, with all his possessions confiscated, and his effigy and that of King Henry VIII burned on bonfires at Linlithgow's marketplace. After Borthwick's departure, several influential Linlithgow merchants petitioned King James, pointing out that as there was now no king's sheriff in the town, they should be allowed to take control of burgh affairs themselves, led by an elected provost. Royal permission was given, and Henry Forrest of Magdalen was chosen as the first ever provost of the borough. At the first Linlithgow council meeting, Lion King of Arms, Sir David Lindsay, arrived and made all members swear that they would observe all Catholic services in the church. Whether many members of the Borough Council had their fingers crossed while taking that oath is not recorded. Henry Forrest, the new provost, himself was a closet Protestant. However, it must have seemed strange to them that the author of the play and satire of the Three Estates, satirically criticising the foibles and antics of the Roman Catholic clergy, and first performed in Linlithgow in 1540, that man was now advocating complete adherence to the old established faith. It was obvious that Sir David Lindsay had acted on the orders of King James, who was not happy at the appointment of Provost Forrest. Within the year, he was replaced by the King's choice, Robert Wotherspoon, described by James as one who is both loyal and applicable, touching sick things as may happen. He was obviously concerned about the anti-Catholic mood that was sweeping the nation. He sent his Sheriff Principal, Henry Stewart, Lord Methven, to Linlithgow on several occasions to ensure that any religious protests were nipped in the bud. In 1552, a provincial council held in the Great Hall of Linlithgow was specifically to devise measures to appease the popular outcry against the Roman Catholic clergy. But such efforts were in vain. And in Linlithgow, a group of Protestant lords signed a covenant, vowing to apply our whole power and our very lives to establishing the Reformed faith. The rebels had to meet in Linlithgow, as the Queen's forces were in charge of Edinburgh, having landed in strength at Leith. The next year, 1558, a Protestant demonstration did take place in Edinburgh at the annual St. Giles' Day procession through the streets. The saint's statue being carried in the parade was seized and ceremoniously drowned in the fetid waters of the Norloch. The writing was on the wall. The French troops who had been sent to Linlithgow were withdrawn to Blackness, where they awaited the arrival of their ships. An English fleet, on the orders of Queen Elizabeth, arrived off the castle to make sure that the French troops did duly embark and return to France. The Linlithgow Town Council, who you remember had once vowed to support the Catholic religion, issued a proclamation that the country was now free from Catholic bondage and from the tyranny of strangers. By 1560, Scotland was officially a Protestant nation, with many aspects of life permanently altered, not just religious, but legal, educational, political, and in its relationships with France and with England. It increased literacy and established a church with greater control over the morality and behaviour of every aspect of society. The Reformation process was complete by August. All French troops had withdrawn, and the Catholic Queen Regent, Mary of Guise, was dead. 100 layers from all over Scotland attended a parliament and gave authority to the production of a Protestant Confession of Faith, issued as the first book of discipline. To be honest, despite the undoubted importance of the Reformation, it does not seem to have made many changes in Linlithgow. A Protestant preacher, Patrick Kinlochie, had formerly been a Catholic canon of St Andrew's Cathedral, and he was appointed to lead Protestant worship in St Michael's. The last Roman Catholic priest, Patrick French, was expelled. Thanks to Kinlochie's efforts, the Roman Catholic master of the town's grammar school, Ninian Winset, was, in that Dominie's own words, expellet and shot out o' my ains friendly tune. Winset had been an excellent teacher, imparting Latin and what he called science and philosophy to the town's lads o' pairts. As a committed Catholic, one who rose every morning in time to officiate at the 5 a.m. Mass at St Michael's altar of the Holy Rood, he had entered into heated debate with John Knox, and accordingly his fate was duly sealed. He left town to become chaplain to Mary Queen of Scots. After her captivity into England, he followed her there. He was eventually forced to flee to Germany, where he established an abbey for training Scots priests, who, it was hoped, would eventually reconvert their homeland. It remained a Scots college until 1862, when the Bavarian government bought the property and turned it into a seminary for training all Catholic priests. Winset's dismissal apart, little else changed. The Catholic clergy, no longer permitted to conduct services, of course, were still paid 2/3 of their income for life. John Knox initially wanted the appointment of bishops in the Church of Scotland, but ultimately the Church preferred the Presbyterian system, where all decisions are made in public meetings. But there was no vindictiveness, no revenge, no violence, and no Catholic martyrs, as there had been in England. Most of the altars were tidied up, and those who had paid for their upkeep in the past obliged to continue paying, the money going into the town's common good fund, and this enabled the town council to continue caring for the fabric of the church. A master of works was appointed, and he supervised the fitting out of the stripped down church for the new form of worship. In order to emphasize this system where the sermon was paramount, a pulpit was set up in the nave and galleries constructed looking onto it. Seats in the gallery were allocated to the monarch, the town magistrates, and members of the gildry, mostly merchants and traders. Thereafter, any local organisation could fit out their own loft area, either with pews or random seats. The absence of uniform control led to some problems, such as when the incorporation of tailors built their loft section higher than that of the magistrates, and to make matters worse, unveiled a huge shield bearing their insignia of a pair of cutting shears and a smoothing iron right in the faces of the borough councillors. Although the population of the town had all once been Roman Catholic, the majority adapted to Protestant worship very quickly, glad, it would seem, to be rid of the pomp and pageantry and corruption of the previous religion. But one result was the church was not treated with the same respect. The chancel was kept relatively dedicated to the worship of God, but other areas of the building were used for a variety of purposes, such as housing labourers who were restoring the roof, much of the lead of that had been stripped off by French troops to make bullets. It was also used for storing 40 large trees, which had been felled for building purposes at the town hall, and John Knox was not happy at that. I mean, can you imagine filling a church full of trees? Unbelievable. Over the years following the Reformation, the local authorities claimed land and property which had previously belonged to the church. This included the priory, the Templar tenements, the grain mills at Linlithgow Bridge and Manuel. They had been owned by the nunnery, whose last prioress, Jean Livingstone, signed over the title deeds. Instead of the papal authorities, the borough now exercised control over the town's church officials. The magistrates laid down rules and regulations concerning the clergy's conduct and duties. In the event of any breach of these, they could summon the cleric to a court hearing in the toll booth. Pastoral care was re-established, and the laity allocated a much larger measure of participation in ecclesiastical affairs. Representatives from the congregation elected their church elders, and meeting as a kirk session had a say in the selection of ministers, although lay patronage meant that in many cases the wishes of the local patron were paramount, and this meant that a monarch, a titled, a landowner, or the borough council could appoint the reverend preacher. Because there was no titular head of the Protestant church, a general assembly was formed to be its governing body, the highest court of the church. 6 ministers and 36 elders and deacons attended the first sitting held in the Magdalen Chapel in the Cowgate in Edinburgh in December 1560. The second sitting in 1561 had rather more, 252 ministers and 621 other members. A motion to only hold a session if the absent Queen Mary allowed it was defeated, with John Knox arguing that the monarch should have no power over the assembly, that Erastianism should never feature in Scottish worship. Mary Queen of Scots did arrive back in Scotland, August 19th, 1562. Her ship had trouble landing at Leith as the summer day was wet and stormy, and as you can imagine, this occasioned John Knox to comment that God was trying to tell them something. And relationships between the outspoken Protestant leader and the young Catholic female monarch did not improve. They had many tense and fiery exchanges. John Knox was elected as the first moderator to preside over the assembly in 1562. The 376th moderator is a former pupil of mine. I knew her as Rosie Bowen, seen here in a school nativity play I produced. She is now Rosemary Frew. Back in the 16th century, the Roman Catholic Church nearly died out. The new laws profoundly affected the nation, with 1,000 years of worship completely swept away, Catholicism outlawed. Scots colleges trained Scots students abroad, and some priests were trained secretly in remote parts of Scotland. But the failure of the 1715 Jacobite rebellion, with its attempt to place a Roman Catholic monarch on the throne, saw increased persecution. It was not until the 19th century that anti-Catholic laws were relaxed and Roman Catholic worship permitted. A large influx of Irish immigrants saw the need for Catholic churches, and so Linlithgow's was designed by the distinguished architects Pugin and Pugin, and first used for worship while still being built in February 1888. So relative harmony has returned to Linlithgow, but not to Scotland as a whole, and sectarianism is still rife in many areas. Scottish memories are long, religious divides still remain, and all dating back to those years you've just lived through, the momentous years of the Reformation. Thank you very much.